Let's say you have a fight outdoors. It's storming, and there's a 1 in 100% chance that lightning strikes in the area every, round of combat.
Mm-hmm.
So you roll percentile, 1% chance, it's random, but you rolled a 100, lightning strikes. Where does it strike?
I don't know if you've noticed, but it is very hot.
Yeah, no, it's just a little bit. It's been, 80s.
Yep.
Mid-80s.
Mm-hmm.
Upper mid-80s.
90s and some days.
We're doing this in Fahrenheit. For those of you in not freedom units, we don't know what that is, sorry, but it is way too hot.
We've actually been intermittently looking at, serious rain showers and then really oppressive heat. It's kind of like a constant back and forth between these two.
Yeah. So much so that the river down the street from my place here has been flooding.
Yeah.
Sure, other rivers too, but,
Sure.
It's the one that's nearby, so it's kind of an issue.
Yeah. And because of those kind of extremes in weather changes, it has a tendency to influence a little bit of what we do on a day-to-day basis. So the reason why we're talking about this is when we get into a lot of tabletop gaming and we're sitting down at a table, we don't have a tendency to talk a lot about weather and how that affects the game. We can easily say what the weather is outside. I gave you a set a little while back of weather dice, but there's no real mechanical or storytelling elements that we typically apply to it. It's kind of an afterthought, even though it's something we deal with a lot in the real world. I don't know if you have had any experiences playing games where the weather directly affected what was happening.
I've had games where the weather is a set piece.
Okay. Yeah.
But it didn't really affect much of what was going on with the character.
Yeah. Even in video games, we don't see it utilized a ton. I have seen some where, obviously, like in farming games, if it's raining outside, you don't need to go in water. And I have seen some games where they will track the weather and it might influence some of your business. I played Tavern Master for a little while, and it affects the number of customers that come into your tavern on any given day if it's cloudy or rainy or whatever. And then, of course, you have some games like Frostpunk where it is literally a mechanic of the game.
Yes.
Right.
Frostpunk, it was very much an important factor in that game. So mechanically, Frostpunk did weather very well.
Right. On a day-to-day basis, though, of, whether it's hot or cold or raining or anything, a lot of games don't really take into account how that's going to influence the story, how it's going to influence the mechanics moving forward.
I will say, a section of gaming does take weather into account fairly often, but not in the story factor, just in the mechanical factor, and that would be any survival game that has cold and heat as a mechanic.
That's true. Survival games have a tendency to do that. I feel like it is one of the bigger afterthoughts of the genre, though, because I played Arid for our live, and you can get sunburn, essentially, but if I rub some clay on me, I mitigate it. And there's not a lot of, changes in the weather from day to day, or, an adaptive or reactive world that you're in. A lot of times, they'll have games that say, oh, well, it's cold right now, and the solution is you wear thermal gear, and now it's not a problem anymore.
And now you're not cold. Thermal makes you just perfectly temperature.
Exactly. You're in perfect temperature, everything is fine. There's a section of Dead Space 3 where you're landing on a planet, and it's an ice planet. And you've been in space up until that point, which I would still think is pretty cold, but when you land on this planet, you don't have thermal gear. And so you can only be outside in this snowstorm for a limited amount of time before you have to get to a base where you have to turn on, the portable heating stations. Until, 10, 15 minutes later, when you unlock the gear that's the thermal gear, and now it's not a problem anymore. And that mechanic never comes up again in the game after that. So you have this one section where you're desperate to find shelter from the storm, and then after you get the right suit and it upgrades, you never have to deal with that issue again for the rest of the game. So it's very much just a casual, an occasional thing that is done to vary gameplay, but it's not a continuous issue where things constantly change with the weather. And I wanted to think about some of the ways we might be able to actually utilize weather in a more interesting way in games. And I go back to those weather dice thinking about this. If there was actually something that would apply to the landscape or to what the characters have to prepare for when we have a rainstorm, we have a thunderstorm. Do we have to think about the gear that we're carrying? Do we have to think about the landscape in general? If we're crossing over rivers or streams, or we're in floodplains and there is a rainstorm, does it close off routes that we would normally take? And could you utilize that in an interesting storytelling capacity to veer people off of the normal path that they would go? You know, what do you think we might be able to do from either a storytelling or a mechanical perspective to kind of use weather in a more interesting way to make tabletop gaming work?
Well, for tabletop, it's a lot different. For video games, there's either going to be one of two types of weather. It's going to be either scripted weather sequences that are going to happen and break things, for instance. A storm that is really big and scripted might destroy a bridge or a section, wash out a road, which you can do. Scripted stuff, that would be fine. The harder part is if it's not scripted stuff, you have to have either the weather needs to be a physics thing.
Yeah.
In that case, or the weather needs to, like, not be able to actually affect anything permanently. So you couldn't have a random rainstorm in a game wash out a road if it's not scripted. I feel like that would be hard to do. Tabletop, we can get away with a lot more because the world is not real. It's not rendered anywhere. It's not physically taking up space. I guess not physically. It's not taking up space on a hard drive to compute that. It's taking imagination, maybe a little drawing if you do that, maybe miniatures if you do that. Tabletop, you can do a lot more. You could have weather vary drastically if you wanted to. It depends on your world. But you can be like, oh yeah, there's a tornado. Which I'm sure there are mechanics in most games to deal with different weather for being like heavy winds, heavy rains, like heat. Lightning is a thing. There's a lot of ways in tabletop you can make the weather actually better for storytelling and better for like dramatic set pieces, or even actually have an effect on things. Let's say you have a fight outdoors. It's storming and there's a 1 in 100% chance that lightning strikes in the area every like round of combat. So you roll percentile, 1% chance, it's random, but you roll the 100, lightning strikes. Where does it strike? Nearby, you figure that out. It could be a set piece, it could be just random and terrifying. Maybe the entire enemy like crew gets lightning strikes a tree behind him and they all fall to the ground because lightning just coursed through their bodies and stunned them. If not killing them. Drop a tornado in the middle of a battlefield.
Yep.
Suddenly you've got a giant set piece that is also destructive.
And can create knockback effects, for that matter.
Either that or pull everyone in and throw them around. That's
also fun. And then there's fall damage that you have to take into account. Destructible environments, all of that good stuff.
There's lots of things you can do with weather. You could make it just a story element. It's been hot. It's been hot for a month. It has not rained in 2 months. Rivers are drying up. The place we get our water from is empty. It's a story element now. It is affecting everyone. You're having to ration water. Create water spells are like a gold mine, but also those are drying up for some reason.
You could also utilize some of the mechanics that are actually in the game in an interesting way. Like, I know in Dungeons and Dragons, you have certain spells, like fire spells, where you would be able to ignite certain flammable objects. There's, and even like lightning bolt and spells like that will do something similar. Going back to that lightning example, or even during an oppressive heat storm, you can play around with that mechanic. For instance, if there's oppressive heat, there is a bigger danger of fire. Maybe it takes far less for any of those burnable surfaces to actually catch on fire.
Yeah. Or maybe you throw an errant firebolt and it catches a forest on fire.
Right. Things that are not necessarily even flammable generally might start to become more of a hassle. If you have oppressive rainstorms and such, I can see it washing out bridges. I could also see it flooding certain areas, which would cut off entire trails of your passageway. And even in a more tactical sense, there's an interesting idea of like, you end up in muddy, wet marshlands, and it affects how much your party can move. It affects how much the enemies can move. If you end up on ice, you might have to roll a percentile dice to see if you slip, or if you fall down, or even through the ice entirely. Hailstorms also could end up being like cold damage if you get hit by them, unless you make a constitution save or something to that effect.
How big are these hailstones? Well, the size of a baseball, you say.
Yes. This is always fun if you end up like on the mountains of like, what is it, the spine of the world, where it's like, and then a gust of wind comes along. Does it knock you off? Yeah, and uh-oh. when you're on those really, really steep cliffs and the gust of wind comes up, oh no. That's not good.
I feel like more often than not, weather comes into play when it's an issue. Less than when it's like, it's either an issue or hazard that you need to deal with, or it's a set piece that just makes the scene more dramatic or more effective.
It would be interesting to see it utilized in a more, maybe a more natural way, like, for instance, something that's not extreme weather patterns, but just like it's raining out today, and that might help divert the party indoors so that they end up in taverns or inns or places where story elements can come into play and NPCs can be presented in a way that on a bright sunny day they might more or less be like out in bazaars and to like meet people that are out there in town. And just have that as a piece that says, you know, we're just adding that element in to explain or inform to the group where they might want to go, and then add in the story elements around that. It doesn't have to be the, it's going to kill my party because we ended up in a landslide,
Although it could. You could still kill the party with a total landslide knockdown, if you will.
Yeah, I've heard about those. Do you think that I'm overthinking this like I normally do, or is it just something we never talk about? Time. No, okay, good. Yay.
Not this time. I do feel like weather should play a part in games more often than it does for the general person, but I also feel like needing to obsess over every single detail of the world isn't really important either. Like, you don't need to make every single session like picture perfect.
Sure.
And if it's not gonna be a set piece, then you're not gonna describe the weather.
Right.
Like, unless you're calling out that it's raining, it's probably going to be assumed that it's nice weather.
Yeah.
It's going to be assumed that it's nice. It's fine. It's not raining. It's not over. So it's generally called out when it is abnormal weather. Even though rain is normal, you could make it a footnote. Be like, yeah, so it's raining, but that means, travel is going to take a little bit longer. Roads are going to be slicker. You're going to be a little bit slower. You know?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I felt like it was one of those things that, considering that you're doing this role-playing and trying to have somewhat of an immersive experience, it made sense that one of the biggest overarching pieces of your world building is going to be what the actual world is doing, and weather is sort of the reactive, dynamic part of the overworld. And we don't have a tendency to really think a lot about it when we're playing games. And it's kind of a shame, because I feel like adding in those elements where the weather really matters makes the game world feel far more lived in, far more realistic for the players, and like it's an actual place that they inhabit. It creates a life and a breath to that world that you normally would not get. And it's usually kind of just tossed onto the side of the road, because storytelling doesn't always involve the weather. Small talk might, but generally storytelling doesn't. And the mechanics of trying to work it out, I think, just get to be a little heady when you're trying to simplify what you're doing in a game. But I'd like to think that there would be some creative ways that you could put it in. And I guess that's the question that I'm going to ask for anyone who might be looking to comment on this video is, do you have any creative ways that you can utilize weather in a game, and have you tried those out? I'd be interested to know, so that we can try to figure out if we can do that at some point next time we play, sometime in the distant future.